Well, thank you very much. Thank you both Betsy and Ryan, but thank all of you for coming out on a cold and icy Vermont night. There's no other kind this time of year, but it's great to see so many people out here, and I really appreciate the fact that you're all willing to support this great tradition, the Vermont Humanities Council's First Wednesdays lectures. I've done a few of them, from St. Johnsbury down to Brattleboro, a couple in between, and they always are a reminder of what a fascinating, engaged, interesting group of Vermonters we have who are really so interested not only in the fate of the nation, but how the story of the nation is told. It's really great to be back here in Manchester. I spoke in this church once before, I think when Confront and Conceal first got published a few years ago. But this is an area that my wife Cheryl, who's somewhere out here in the audience, and I really love. We've been coming back here, I guess we've been coming here for probably 35 years, and we've had a house up the mountain for about nearly 25, and our kids have sort of grown up with a real love of Vermont as a result. The only thing that we have to regret about it is that we spend more of our time in DC than up here, but it's an occupational hazard. When I first got called last year and was told of the theme that you were going to be doing this year, which was the Pulitzer celebration and campfire, I was a little bit surprised. I mean, after all, who does lectures on the anniversary of a prize? But then I realized it wasn't really about the prize at all. Partly it was about the campfire. I was imagining my colleagues and I throwing our notes into the campfire before prosecutors managed to get to them. We have the equivalent of campfires periodically in our newsroom. We rarely bring marshmallows, but we do try to get rid of the notes as quickly as we can. But no, it's not really about this prize. It's really a celebration of the arts that so strengthen America and our culture, our creativity, and in the case of the journalism Pulitzers, I think have a huge role in strengthening our democracy. I'll be telling a few stories tonight because it is the campfire that will try to take you a little bit into how Pulitzer teams operate, or how teams operate when they have no idea that they are actually likely to win a Pulitzer, but are just actually off chasing a good story. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention to you that the range of the Pulitzers is really quite extraordinary. There's nothing quite like it. They go from, of course, photography to fiction and nonfiction, from feature writing to explanatory journalism to foreign correspondence work, and then the part that, of course, is dearest to my heart, which is investigative journalism and what we're here to discuss tonight. Your timing is good. In January, the Pulitzer Board decided to hold its own celebration of the 100th anniversary. And so they took over the museum in Washington, and they invited all of the living and some just barely living Pulitzer winners who they could round up in Washington, New York, out the coast, many abroad, and they all jammed in, and I could not believe when I got there how big the party was, which told you how many people had a piece of these Pulitzers over the years. You walked into the giant lobby of the museum, some of you may have been down in there, and you could barely move. And I was trying to figure out why that was until I discovered that in the middle of the museum they had set up a bar. And of course, they had invited journalists to a bar in which the Pulitzer Board was picking up the tab. So you could imagine this mix of journalists and free alcohol. And so it was no wonder that nobody could move. But it was really quite remarkable just to look around and see who you would bump into. Marty Barron I ran into, who you may have seen portrayed in Spotlight. I'll talk about that in a moment. David Hume Kennerly, the very famous photographer, a bunch of novelists and great literature writers who were wondering what they were doing hanging out with the likes of all of us. There were some panels. They had Bob Woodward there to give it some air of seriousness. And then the Times went off and had its own party for its own reporters and photographers and others who had won. And even that took up 3 rooms of a big restaurant in D.C. Now, that shouldn't have surprised me because the Times has won 117 Pulitzers in the past decade. That's more than twice as many as the next biggest recipient. I went back and looked at the list. The first was in 1918 to the entire newspaper for coverage of the war. That would have been World War I, or as it was called optimistically at the time, the War to End All Wars. Over the years, just looking at the Times list, there have been awards for covering the rise of Nazi Germany. There's been awards for the rise of modern China. There was one for the creation of the Neediest Cases Fund by the Times, still one of my favorite charities. There were several for the great Scotty Reston, who I had the privilege to know a bit toward the end of his life, and whose title later on I inherited. He won first in 1945 for the coverage of the Dumbarton Oaks Conference that created the World Bank and the IMF. And I was thinking as I was looking at that, can you imagine today winning a Pulitzer Prize for covering the World Bank and the IMF? I don't think that would work. But the coverage was pretty amazing. And then, of course, if you've got a big, astounding award and an institution like the New York Times, there's got to be a scandal around at least one of the awards. And indeed, there was one. In 1932, when Walter Duranty, who had been based in Russia, wrote a series of 13 stories about Stalin's Russia and managed along the way, either because of his own inclinations or the Soviet censorship at the time, not to mention the brutality of the regime. So that one's got a big asterisk by it and a letter from the Times suggesting that perhaps the coverage wasn't as fulsome as it should be. There was a big debate about whether the Times should give it back, but Mr. Duranty was no longer around to be the one giving it back. And it's a reminder that nothing in the world is perfect, even the Pulitzers. There are things that win that probably never should. There are things that don't win that probably, in the retrospect of history, certainly should have. But the important part of the prize, I think, is not what wins and doesn't win. It's the way it spurs the imagination, and has over the past 100 years, of each new generation of journalists. And I think that may be one of the greatest values of what is otherwise sometimes an exercise in celebration, sometimes in self-congratulations, and sometimes in celebration of true courage in journalistic enterprise. I was a teenager during Watergate, and I have no doubt that the work of Woodward and Bernstein, the Pulitzer that followed, but more importantly, the impact of that journalism, helped drive me into the business. By the time I got to college, I was with a range of other young journalists, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, who had grown up in the same atmosphere. And when I look back at it, a remarkable number of people who were on our school newspaper ended up in journalism, many at the Times, many you see on TV each day, a very large cohort of extremely talented people. But it wasn't just Watergate. By the time I got to college, I began to go back and read the works of some previous generations who had won the Pulitzer. I think of David Halberstam's great reporting from Vietnam, which led Jack Kennedy as president to call the editor of the Times and suggest that maybe it was time for Mr. Halberstam to be reassigned. That's usually a good sign your reporter's on the right story. J. Anthony Lucas, who did some phenomenal local reporting and later went on to write some truly amazing books. But the list is long. And I'm privileged to work in the Washington Bureau of the Times, where I'm now in, I think, year 21 of a 3-year assignment. And if you screw up enough, you just stay in the right place. To be in the Washington Bureau of the Times these days is really to be among the densest collection, I think, of currently practicing Pulitzer winners just about anywhere in the world, all pursuing the same really bad pot of coffee that we have in the morning. My colleagues Jim Risen and Eric Lichtblau in the Bureau won a number of years ago for revealing the warrantless wiretapping program, or what President Bush called the terrorist protection program, which was his way of justifying completely ignoring congressional legislation about how one goes about approving wiretaps. It was President Bush who sat down in the Oval Office with our publisher and our executive editor at the time and our Washington Bureau chief at the time, and made an hour-long argument about why the Times should not publish those stories. They walked out of the White House, said to each other, anybody hear anything new out of this? No. And 2 days later, they published it. I sit in the Bureau between Eric Schmidt, who's been part of several Pulitzers on military and intelligence issues, and a wonderful, quiet colleague named Eric Lipton, who won last year for being the scourge of lobbyists in Washington. And as you heard, I've been lucky enough to be the member of 2 or 3 teams, actually, that have won for group journalism, which I'll be talking about, the Challenger investigation, China, 9/11, and I'll come back to all of that in a bit. I mentioned this long list of Times correspondents not to make a case about why you should be a print or digital subscriber, although I think you should be, but because I think it's worthwhile, especially in this presidential election season, to think about what it is we're trying to protect in keeping this kind of journalism going. Just last week, we had one candidate calling for laws that would enable the government of the United States, or I guess himself if he got elected, to crack down on reporting he didn't like. He said we're going to have significantly tighter libel laws, and that life would be pretty miserable for a couple of publications whose work he thought didn't measure up to his own standards. He mentioned the Times and the Post in particular. Now, would not be the first time an American politician looked to take such steps. Abe Lincoln didn't care much for much of the reporting about how he was handling the Civil War, but he ultimately fired McClellan. There was a remarkable Union general, General Sheridan, who used to read the reports of reporters who followed his camp, the original embedded reporters, and when he didn't like it, he locked them up in the brig. I mentioned this once to General Petraeus when we were having a conversation over dinner one night, and he said to me, why didn't I think of that? But the fact of the matter is that for all that you hear on the campaign trail, for all the complaining you hear, for all of the leak investigations that we go through, and I remind you that Barack Obama has prosecuted more leak investigations than all previous presidents combined. A statistic that his administration does not particularly like to hear, but those of us who've been on the receiving end of them, and I've certainly have in recent years, like to repeat, that despite all of that, what we are able to do in this country in challenging the sitting government, whether it's Democrats or Republicans or anyone else, is really unlike anything else that happens anywhere in the world. America celebrates journalism that is encouraged to challenge the ruling regime. And we should think about what a rare thing that is. Just last week, Xi Jinping, the president of China, declared outright that the purpose of the media in China was to support the party. Now, we didn't have a whole lot of doubt, given what he's done in closing newspapers that he didn't care for, websites that he didn't care about, the kind of internet censorship that's underway. But to actually go out and give that as a speech, I thought took some remarkable nerve and shows you how unembarrassed the Chinese regime is about that. In Russia, when we were celebrating Glasnost after the fall of the Berlin Wall, you saw a real explosion of some really creative, interesting, investigative media that ended up putting a lot of the oligarchs out of business and a few in jail. But in the past few years, while Xi has been cracking down in China, you've seen Vladimir Putin engage in a media crackdown unlike any that we've witnessed since those days when Walter Duranty was in Stalin's Soviet Union. Mexico, needless to say, has become the most dangerous place to practice journalism almost any place in the world. Japan, where I spent 6 years, is a very safe place to practice journalism. But the journalists actually gather into clubs that are organized around government ministries. And in the days when I was there, you would walk into some of these clubs and there'd be a big blackboard with a list of the topics that they were not going to discuss, which usually involved, among other things, the sitting minister's girlfriends and other such topics. Britain's Official Secrets Act suppresses a lot of news. And when the Snowden revelations came out and included a lot of information from GCHQ, the British organization that is the equivalent of our national security agency, there were investigators who came into the offices of The Guardian, went down into the basement, and used sledgehammers to start busting apart hard drives that contained the Snowden documents. They literally came in and busted up computers. Now, the editor of The Guardian at the time went downstairs and explained to them quite calmly that he had anticipated this move, and that's why a full set of the documents was sitting in New York, in the headquarters of the New York Times, where the British authorities and the Official Secrets Act probably would have a harder time getting that done. But that tells you that when even our closest ally, a country on which we have based at least the architecture of much of our constitutional system, engages in that kind of behavior, what we have going on in this country is quite rare and worth fighting to preserve. And even here in America, there are pressures on journalists that are far more subtle, but quite real. So I mentioned Spotlight before, and we got a chance to go to it just this weekend. If you haven't seen it, you should go. It's a terrific film, as you could see by how it did at the Oscars the other night. But it also does a very excellent job of recreating the feel of a newsroom, with all of its cynicism and wisecracks and late nights and dedication to digging down deep. It explains, I think, really well why the best journalism is really a team sport. that having many journalists on a story, or at least a good tight team on a story, is a great way of challenging ideas and making sure that when you go down blind holes, and you'll go down many of them, that you've got someone to help pull you back out of them. It also explores, I thought, the movie explores our imperfections, and we've got lots of them as an industry. And our inability at times to see a story that's right in front of us because it seems like things have always been that way. So one of the subtexts of Spotlight is the question of why a series of events that were really an open secret in Boston, the abuse of children by priests, had defied coverage for so long, and why it took an outsider like Marty Baron, who came from the Times and then from Florida to be the editor of the Globe, took somebody from the outside to say, why aren't we putting more effort into this story? And then to corral the talent that needed to be corralled in order to tell it. And of course, there was a big element of government complicity in that story. You see these scenes where the prosecutors come into the station house and immediately make sure there are no reporters around or no records left about the arrests of one of the priests. They all helped sweep the evidence under the rug. The church made sure that the documents were sealed. Those lessons, the outsider asking questions, the government invested in covering up or at least not raising uncomfortable issues, was a lesson I learned pretty early, fresh out of college, exactly 30 years ago. The Challenger explosion was late January 1986. I'm sure many of you here remember that day. It was an incredibly clear day. It was cold. We were looking at what looked like another routine flight for the space shuttle, and it takes off in a minute and a half into the flight, just through that moment of maximum pressure where it's turning and just beginning to exit the atmosphere. You saw it blow apart in that incredible fireball and great tragedy. It looked at first like it was just a horrific accident, something that nobody could have predicted, that no one could have seen coming. I remember that morning, I was in the Washington Bureau of the Times, visiting there while working on another story on another subject, and I saw Bill Kovich, who was our Tennessee-born bureau chief at the time. He had one big cowboy-booted foot up on a desk, and he looked up at the TV, and he just kept saying, "It's just too damn cold. It's just too damn cold." Now, Bill, as he admitted to me later on, knew absolutely nothing about this technology of the space shuttle, but it turned out that his gut was right. We didn't know that at the time. We only knew that Ronald Reagan had given that dramatic speech that afternoon that Peggy Noonan wrote about the brave astronauts who touched the face of God. We didn't know that a few weeks later, when he asked a former Secretary of State, Bill Rogers, to form a presidential commission and look into the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, that his instructions to Rogers were that whatever he concluded, be sure to protect NASA and the space program, because they were the heroes who had put men on the moon, and because they were critical to the Cold War fight that was still going on. Remember, we were 3 years away from the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, the group of reporters who were organized to do the investigation that afternoon was a group that came together somewhat haphazardly. Our executive editor, Abe Rosenthal, ordered a team put together, and we had everyone from veteran space reporters like John Noble Wilford, who I hadn't seen for years until he showed up at that party in Washington last month, to young reporters like Bill Broad, to people with experience covering science in Washington like Phil Boffey. And I was the low man on the totem pole, thrown in because I was covering the computer industry back in the days when there were only 2 or 3 New York Times reporters who wrote about computers. We now have a small army of people, a digital army that does this. There was a theory afoot at the time that the IBM computer systems, very ancient ones that ran the space shuttle, had somehow been responsible for a malfunction that triggered the explosion. We pursued that theory for a while, and that's why I was put on the team, and it didn't pan out at all. But along the way, as we were exploring what was going on with the space shuttle, we got a tip from someone who was pretty deep down in the NASA bureaucracy and whose job it had been to assess the cost of the space shuttle program in the years going forward. And along the way, he told us, showing up in our bureau one day after we had tracked him down, he had a big sheaf of documents, he told us that NASA had had a series of past incidents, more than a dozen, as we later discovered, where the seals that connected those giant rockets, remember the 2 rockets that would be on the side of the space shuttle and propel it up, had nearly burned through. And he had had to look at these because they were a potential big cost for the space shuttle program going forward. He was told not to say very much about those previous 12 accidents, and certainly not to write them up as a potential cost for the future. That got our attention pretty quickly. And as we dug in, we discovered pretty quickly that there was a reason that NASA had gone to such lengths to cover up those past near accidents. The economics of the space shuttle were incredibly precarious. The argument to Congress for continuing to fund the program was that it would quickly become a dump truck to the stars, that you could get to the point fairly quickly of running one mission every 2 weeks, 26 a year, and that it would regularly go up, come back, go up, come back, and if you didn't run it that fast, the economics of the entire enterprise seemed to fall apart. And we also discovered that a lot of the best talent in NASA had left after the moonshot to go off inventing all kinds of other technologies, including heading into the early days of the computer business. And we discovered that the analysts who had begun to look at the cost of repairing the shuttle had quickly come to the conclusion that if in fact you had to go redesign the entire shuttle to avoid the kind of accident that was nearly happening on just about every other flight, you'd probably have to shut the whole program down for 2 or 3 years and redesign the rocket from the start. These were all things that NASA was not telling anybody. They certainly weren't telling that presidential commission, which they hoped would do a quick pass over how the program worked, say this was an awful accident, come up with a few recommendations, and send the program right back to where it was. Well, we started looking at this evidence and looking at more of it and getting into the story of why the space shuttle was designed with these segments anyway. That was a pretty remarkable tale. It turned out the head of NASA at the time came from Utah, and he wanted to make sure that a local company named Morton Thiokol got the contract to build the rockets. There were 2 competing designs. One was a single rocket with none of the seams, nothing that had these burn-throughs. And that was done by a company that was down near New Orleans and would build the rocket and put it on a barge and float it around to Cape Canaveral. The other company, Morton Thiokol, was of course in Utah, landlocked. if they were going to get the rocket to Cape Canaveral, they were going to have to put it on a train. The train was going to have to go through bends. The rocket couldn't bend. So they built it in segments, and the segments had to be connected. And thus started the problem that ultimately created the disaster that pretty much ended America's adventures in space. Now, we didn't know that at the time. It took a lot of time and a lot of interviews to get that out. What we did know was that Morton Thiokol was not particularly interested in answering any of our questions. When we showed up in Ogden, Utah, it was made clear that the New York Times was considered a bunch of outsiders, and they weren't even getting in the building. We somehow got a hold of a company directory and began to figure out who worked on different parts of the projects based on their titles, and began to make sort of a virtual map of where everybody sat in the building and figured out who worked on what. And then at night, we started knocking on doors or making phone calls until one day, I managed to hit pay dirt with one engineer, a Roman Catholic living in the midst of Mormon Utah, who had never really been invited to the company picnics, had never really been accepted in the community, and whose advice had been completely rejected when the night before the launch, he sent a series of faxes to Cape Canaveral saying, at the temperature at which you're planning to launch, your chances of having a burn through of one of these seals was extremely high. And of course, when the seal burned through, that flame superheated, hit that huge tank of fuel that you would see, that big orange tank on the back of the space shuttle, and you know what happened after that. I got the engineer at just the right moment. He had just been watching TV when he had gotten home from work, and he had seen a series of NASA executives on TV lying outright about what had happened and the mystery of what possibly could have caused this, when he knew what they knew. And he used the moment to share with us the faxes. And we immediately turned around. It was one of those few stop the presses moments, and led the New York Times the next morning with a story whose lead I looked up today said, the top Morton Thiokol engineer present at the Kennedy Space Center before the January 28th liftoff, the Space Shuttle Challenger, said tonight he had argued for hours with space agency officials not to launch the craft because of low temperatures. He said he had persisted even after his own superiors had overruled him and given the agency the go-ahead. And you can imagine the impact of that. At that moment, the Presidential Commission no longer could conduct the kind of cover-up that Ronald Reagan had in mind, because they were being forced by what was appearing in the paper to go give a more thorough account. Now, that started a sort of odd dynamic, because there were members of the commission who really wanted to get at the truth and were afraid they weren't getting the right documents. And then eventually they pulled out ahead of us, and we needed to understand where they were taking the investigation. And the cover-up was pretty thorough. I remember early on in this process, we filed a bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests for various documents related to the past launches. And you can imagine exactly where NASA put those Freedom of Information Act requests. That's when I learned how Washington worked. I went in to see Bill Kovich, the guy who had just been saying it's too damn cold. And I was explaining our problem, and he said, "David, you're going about this wrong." So he called up a Tennessee senator, a guy named Al Gore, who I hadn't really heard much about before, who was on the science committee. And I remember listening to him on the phone. He said, "Al, I'm going to send my boys up to you, and they've got some documents they need to have subpoenaed because they can't get them through Freedom of Information Act." So your committee can decide whether you want to go subpoena them, and then when you're done subpoenaing them, the boys will explain to you what some of them mean. Well, Al Gore didn't have much problem with this, and we went up there and explained it, and nothing happened for a while, and then mysteriously, some of the documents that we were looking for ended up getting subpoenaed, and somehow or another they managed to make their way onto the front page of the New York Times. I have no idea how that happened. And eventually NASA began to figure out that the documents that they were turning down for FOIA were showing up on Capitol Hill shortly thereafter. Well, there were some other interesting adventures. I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I just want to mention my favorite one. It came from Richard Feynman. You may remember the famous physicist. Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman was his book. He had had a remarkable career as a young physicist. He was working on the Manhattan Project, and the night before the Trinity test, he was sent to go up a scaffolding and wire the world's first atomic bomb together. And while he was up there, a lightning storm broke out. And he said, this really isn't good. I'm out in the middle of the desert on the top of a giant metal scaffolding, wiring together a nuclear bomb in a lightning storm. But somehow he got through that, and once he got through that, he figured everything else was going to be pretty easy. He was put on the commission. He had read our stories. He had asked a lot of questions of NASA. And one night I was in a hotel in Washington, and he called me around midnight, and he said, I need you to take me to a store where I can get some pliers. And I said, Professor Feynman, it's midnight. He said, I don't care what time it is. There's got to be a store open. Come pick me up. So I got into a taxi, and I went around, and I picked him up, and we ended up at a all-night pharmacy where he got some pliers, and he began to explain to me on the way back what he was planning to go do. And the next morning was that famous test where he took a piece of the rubber from the rocket seals, squeezed them together with the pliers, put it in a glass of ice water that he had called for, and he showed that once it had sat in the ice water for a little while, it could not spring back into its position, thus explaining why the flames made it so easily through that joint. If anybody other than a Nobel physics laureate had tried this, they would have been laughed out of the commission. But because he was Richard Feynman, he couldn't be. And that pretty well sealed the story. I had the chance to be on a lot of other investigations, not quite with the same drama. As you heard, we won for a series of stories about high technology exports to China, which is a major subject in the Clinton administration. We didn't win, but got to finalist with a series of stories about a man named A.Q. Khan, a Pakistani who sold nuclear technology to Iran, to North Korea, to Libya. And again, it was the same thing. The US government had a very good idea what was going on, but didn't want the story to get out for fear that it would get in the way of our cooperation with Pakistan in counterterrorism, which has worked just brilliantly over the past few years, as you know. We looked at the story and saw something else, that for the first time in the nuclear age, somebody had gotten involved in a black market operation to sell nuclear components around the world. We got onto the story because one day in 2003, the Bush administration accused the North Koreans of secretly going off in violation of an agreement that they had struck during the Clinton years and enriching uranium, much as you read about in Iran's case in the recent times. And we knew they had to go get the technology someplace, because if you're North Korean, you just don't come up with enrichment technology wandering around the streets of Pyongyang. But everybody in the US government was very silent about the question of how the North Koreans had gotten this very advanced technology. So we began to travel around the world, talking to the South Koreans and their intelligence operations, talking to the British, the French, others who had followed this. And over the course of 14 months, began to establish the story of A.Q. Khan, a Pakistani who was working for the government, had only had government engineering jobs, and yet lived in one of the most spectacular houses you could ever see in Islamabad. Now, no one in Pakistan thought this was strange because they figured that he was just on the take from the government like every other senior official that they had seen along the way. But it turned out that instead he had established businesses around the world, in Malaysia and then in Dubai, to sell these nuclear components. And over time, we made our way to Vienna, to the International Atomic Energy Agency, which had collected a lot of this same data, but unlike the US government, did not have a lengthy series of procedures for classifying material. And so we discovered along the way that when A.Q. Khan sold these components, he sometimes threw in a few things. You know, you buy the car, you get the free radio. In this case, you buy the components to make the centrifuges that would teach you to enrich uranium or allow you to enrich uranium. And the prize that came along with it was the full blueprints for a nuclear weapon that the Chinese set off in the early 1960s. And in fact, this was what the United States was trying to collect up around the world. We spent 14 months doing this investigation with my colleague Bill Broad before we published our first story. It ran in January of 2004 with this anecdotal lead to try to get people sucked into stories. The Pakistani leaders who denied for years that scientists at the country's secret A.Q. Khan research laboratories were peddling advanced nuclear technology must have been averting their eyes from a most conspicuous piece of evidence. The laboratory's own sales brochure, quietly circulated to aspiring nuclear weapon states and a network of nuclear middlemen around the world. The cover bears an official-looking seal that says Government of Pakistan and the photograph of the father of the Pakistani bomb, Abdul Qadir Khan. It promotes components that were spin-offs from Pakistan's 3-decade-long project to build its own nuclear stockpile of enriched uranium, set in a drawing that bears a striking resemblance to a mushroom cloud. This man was not subtle. When we published the story, very senior members of the Bush administration were kind enough to call up and thank us and tell us that they thought that the story's publication had actually resulted in the arrest of Khan by the Pakistani authorities. We said, thanks a lot, because you guys had been of absolutely no use as we had pursued the investigation. But that's usual. I spent a number of years in recent times reporting out a program called Olympic Games, which was the first American cyber attack on another country against Iran. It started a significant leak investigation. I hope that it's contributed a little bit to the debate about what kind of doctrine we want for using cyber weapons around the world. A hot topic even today and getting hotter all the time. But again, it's something the government was not prepared to discuss yet. Which takes me to my final thought here, which is these stories have something in common. They stand at the intersection of modern technology and modern geopolitics. They raise questions that the government thinks it's not ready to go raise in public, because to do so is to threaten ongoing investigations, ongoing programs like the space shuttle, the ongoing development of a doctrine like how to go use cyber weapons. Journalists come to this with a very different mindset. Their mindset is that while not every government secret needs to be made public, there are some subjects that are so big, how we use nuclear weapons, how we control them, how we use cyber weapons, what goes into our decision to pursue a space program that may not have had clear objectives, that these are things that we need to put on the agenda. The founders never had in mind that journalists would decide anything. And believe me, having hung out with journalists for as long as I have, that's probably a really good thing. But I think the founders did have in mind that it was necessary to make sure that the government was not fully in control of the agenda of what we discuss as a nation. And that the ability to come back and bring out things that the government doesn't want out, that presidential candidates don't want out, that the leaders of China and Russia don't want out, is really in many ways what makes our democratic process so different. And I think in some ways so treasured. One last thought. People frequently say to me, okay, this is great. You guys are old media. You've been around for a long time. What about the new digital journalism? Isn't that the death knell of investigative journalism? A few years ago, I might have agreed with that. When BuzzFeed was getting all that traffic for doing listicles. I didn't go into this business to do listicles. I didn't go into this business to do 140-character tweets. I'm not sure I've ever written a lead shorter than 140 characters. But over time, what have we seen happening? The surviving or most successful new digital news organizations have discovered that to distinguish themselves, they have to go back and do some old-form journalism. BuzzFeed's actually hiring real reporters. So's Yahoo. They're doing real investigations. Would they allow their reporters 14 months to go do AQCon? I doubt it. I don't know that I'd get away with 14 months doing AQCon, again, in a world that's under these kind of pressures. But the answer to the question of whether digital journalism is the end of investigations and the kind of journalism we know, I think is sort of the wrong question. It doesn't have to do with the format of the journalism. If you're reading it on paper, if you're reading it on your iPad, if you're reading it on your phone, if 20 years from now we're able to beam the New York Times front page directly into your cerebral cortex, and we have a team working on it, it doesn't really make that big a difference. What makes a difference is the kind of questions you saw played out so well in the movie that we were talking about before, Spotlight. Do you have editors with patience who say, let's not rush this into the paper, let's put together the bigger story? Do you have the resources to keep that going so that there is not so much pressure on the daily journalism that you're not keeping teams running in the background working on big projects? Are you constantly investing in the reporting talent that it takes? A mix of young energy and people who are asking the right questions because they've been around long enough to do that. Do you have the kind of editors who are willing to look at the story and come back to you and say, you know, this is really interesting, and you don't have the story yet, and it's time to go back and do it again and do it deeper? So the question isn't digital versus print. It's not TV versus internet. It's whether or not we preserve the space to do that kind of journalism. And there are all different kinds of models for doing it. You've seen some very good investigative journalism done by a group that is basically now a foundation that is funded more by people interested in good charitable works and good investigations than it is by readers. You've seen the New York Times move gradually away from an advertising model to a subscriber model. There's more revenue, or at least an increasing amount of revenue coming from people like all of you who are paying for this journalism because that's what you want to go read each day. You're seeing all kinds of experiments with new economic models. Some will work and some won't. The question isn't as much whether or not we can simply keep doing what we've done. It's whether we can preserve the kind of practices that we know over time really work for all of this. So I want to leave a little bit of time, 15 or 20 minutes here, for your questions on anything I've discussed, but anything else you may want to raise. I understand there's a little presidential election going on. I've been reading that. There's a lot of other things of interest happening in the world. So I thank you for coming out tonight. I look forward to our discussion. Thanks very much. Great, I see a hand right back here, and I'm going to repeat your questions just because I've got a mic and I'm not sure there are microphones going around. So,
would you please comment on two things, Snowden and Apple versus FBI?
Great, two great questions. How many hours do you have? Okay. So, on Snowden, look, I have no doubt that he violated every agreement that he made to the United States government, every commitment he made, that he violated our classification laws, and that for some brief period of time, he probably told the Russians and the Chinese some things with the documents he released that they didn't know before. And for that, he'll either stay in exile or he'll come back and at some point get tried and I suspect sentenced. But I think you can believe that he violated all of his own commitments and also hold the belief that he did some good. And I think he did. Because we now have an understanding of how the government organized itself to do some things that once exposed, the government was no longer comfortable doing. So let me give you an example. Every year of his presidency, Barack Obama reauthorized a program in which the US government was collecting the metadata, the phone numbers, the duration of calls, and so forth, for every call made in the United States. Even though only a tiny number of those were actually being searched by the NSA, and when a presidential commission dug into it and tried to find out how many of those searches actually helped in a significant terrorism investigation, the answer they came up with was 0. In the months after it was revealed, President Obama decided maybe we didn't need that program running that way anyway, after all. And now, as of last November, it's moved back to the telephone companies that have always collected that data to do their billing. Now, you can decide yourself whether you're feeling safer having that database in the hands of the US government or having it in the hands of AT&T and Verizon and Sprint. And I can see risks either way. But I think it is interesting that a program revealed by Snowden forced the president ultimately to change American practice. Similarly, when people tried to explain why it is that we were tapping Angela Merkel's cell phone, the answer seemed to be because the program was on autopilot and no one was reviewing it. So I think some good things have come out of what undoubtedly was some damaging leaks along the way. As somebody who writes a lot about cyber, I know I learned a lot about how the government goes about doing what it's doing, and some of it was deeply reassuring and some of it wasn't. Now, your second question is about Apple versus the FBI, and this is a story I've been fascinated by since we wrote the first stories about Apple changing the way that it encrypts its data. It made a change about 1.5 years ago so that it no longer held the key to the data that's encrypted. So if I call you on an iPhone, or better yet, I text you on your iPhone, and it's iPhone to iPhone, our two iPhones are having a little conversation that we don't know anything about, where they're setting up an encrypted key that's used for that message and that message alone. You don't really have the key to it, except that it's based on that 4 or 6 digit code you've typed in to have access to your own phone. Same thing for the recipient. And what's outraged the FBI is that Apple itself doesn't have the key. So when they come to them in a case like the one that you've seen out of San Bernardino, Apple says, sorry, can't help you. Now, if you live in the security world of the FBI or local police, this seems outrageous. It seems like there's a car trunk to which no one has the key. There's a secret compartment in a house to which no one can actually break in. And they're doing all of their analogies to old form search warrants, or to the ability to get a warrant to intercept a conversation that you're having on your landline from your house to someone else. And I can see why they would do that. But your iPhone or your Android phone is much more than just a communication device. Your whole life is in there. Your medical records are probably in there. Your tax returns are probably in there. Your emails are in there to your spouse, to your kids. Data about where you have been is there, because if your phone is on right now and your data location services are on, somebody can figure out where in Manchester you were sitting between 7 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. this evening. It's a lot more data than just a phone call. And that's why we need to have this much broader debate about how easily you want the government to be able to get at all of that data. So, we've learned a few things in the past few weeks. Number one, Apple can get inside that phone, despite all of its protestations to the contrary, because they've always kept the ability to go in and rewrite the operating system and the firmware. It's a lot of work, but they can do it. We've also learned that the government is making the argument that this case is about this one phone and this one terror incident. And no one believes that. Because if you can do it once, you can do it immediately. And just yesterday, in some congressional testimony, the district attorney in New York said, yes, we've got 150 cases lined up where we want to do the same thing if we can. So there's a lot at stake in this one. And I'm fascinated by how divided the US government itself is. We know where Jim Comey, the head of the FBI, is. But a lot of members of the intelligence community and a lot of people who lead the Pentagon are much more interested in secure communications because they know people are trying to break into the systems all the time. And if the government creates a back door, the Chinese and the Russians are going to be the first ones to walk through it. Well, because it was with the Washington Post, I can't shed a huge amount of light about this, but it was written by an extremely talented reporter named Dana Priest and some of her colleagues who spent an enormous amount of time looking at exactly how the people who were coming back from the wars were being treated and discovering that Walter Reed was, like many of the other hospitals in that system, fundamentally pretty dysfunctional. And the fact of the matter is that many in the Pentagon had not paid much attention to it. And they read it first in the Washington Post. And, on the one hand, that's pretty shocking. And on the other hand, you think, well, Bob Gates is running one of the world's largest businesses at that time. He was running a Pentagon that was engaged in 2 wars and basically had 500,000 people working for them. And I'm not entirely shocked that he wasn't aware. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying I'm not surprised. So the question is about the U.S. policy in Okinawa. And just to give you a little bit of history here, I don't normally know all this stuff, but I spent 6 years in Japan, and so we did a fair bit of reporting in Okinawa. Astoundingly, it would usually begin on about a Friday afternoon for some reason. Okinawa is one of the most beautiful corners of Japan, and certainly the warmest. It's also where the preponderance of American troops in Japan are located. And that's because Okinawa was not given back to Japan until the late 1960s. And it was a major Cold War base for the US troops. And then once the troops were there, they sort of stayed there. And we fought pretty hard to get Okinawa. My dad, who's now 92 and couldn't make it up here tonight, much as he loves Vermont, was in that battle and tells the story of how they laid out an airfield one night to land the American planes as the U.S. was beginning to land in Okinawa. And the airfield that they bulldozed out one night is now at the center of a very large American base, and there are many other bases. So the problem that Japan has run into is that the Japanese, on the one hand, say, and the Okinawans say, they don't want this huge dominance of American presence there. They don't want an airfield built out over a coral reef that could well kill the reef, and they've got a pretty good argument about that. And periodically, the American troops who are there get in some pretty bad situations with locals. There have been a number of cases of rapes and other criminal activity, and these get huge publicity. The American position has been, hey, we're the last thing standing between you and you're getting run over by the Chinese and the North Koreans. So if you don't want the bases on Okinawa, that's fine, but come up with an alternative and we'll work out a way to split the cost and we'll move the bases. But of course, the Japanese don't want to move the bases to the main Japanese islands. And there's a big split between the native Okinawans and the rest of Japan. And so mostly this has been a problem inside Japan of their inability to go find an alternative. There was a hand up right next to you. So the question is, what about the cyber attacks we've seen against hospitals? And it's not just hospitals. In yesterday's paper, I wrote a story about the studies into what shut off the electricity in the Ukraine the week between Christmas and New Year's, when 225,000 people lost power in what was the first attack that we've ever seen that shut off an electric grid. Hospitals are relatively easy to turn off because they've got relatively open networks. So they've got doctors coming in from a lot of different places. They've got to share a lot of data. And so hospitals and universities tend to be the most open networks, which also means they're the most vulnerable networks. This gets at the central problem that we are confronting as we are trying to tighten up the security of our increasingly networked world. And the problem is this, that most of the targets in the United States and other big industrialized countries are not in the hands of governments. They are in the hands of the private sector. They're the banks, the utilities, the hospitals, the cell phone networks, everything that makes our society run. And yet, because they're in the hands of private industry, which have varying resources, and some of which are more vital infrastructure than others, you can't have the government simply mandate that you are going to do X, Y, and Z to secure your networks, because someone's going to have to go pay for it. And the things you need to do to secure the stock exchange are a very different thing that you need to go secure Rutland Hospital, and a very different set of steps that you need to go secure a power plant that's running southern Vermont or the Ukraine. Now, if you're an attacker, you may have very different motives. We've all seen the attacks on Target and Home Depot, and we are assuming that most of those are criminal and were intended to get your credit card number. Those are relatively easy to protect against. And once you're attacked, relatively easy to solve. You can change your credit card number. But what about the Chinese attack on the Office of Personnel Management, which took the security records of 22 million Americans, 7% of the population, but a very elite 7% that had security clearances? The US government's response to this has been to offer those 22 million people credit protection, as if the Chinese were interested in taking their Target credit cards. That's not really what the Chinese had in mind. They were interested in building a profile of everybody who runs the US government. And they were interested in taking a look at what files aren't in there, because they know, as we all know, that if you work for the US government, your file is sitting in OPM, or at least it was, they just took them, a lot of them away from them. But if you happen to work for, say, the CIA, they keep a separate file. So if you're coming through the Beijing airport and you're on your way to your job as the second agricultural attaché in the American embassy in Beijing, and they take your fingerprint at the airport, as most places do when you come in now, and they look later and they say, gee, your fingerprint's not in our file, one of those 22 million files that we stole, they've got a pretty good idea that you're interested in more than fluctuations in the prices of Chinese wheat. So the intelligence utility of this information is huge. And then, of course, they're the kinds of cyber attacks that I spend most of my time looking at, which are not really hospitals or information theft, but actual manipulation of real-world things, which is what we did to the Iranians when we made those centrifuges blow up in Natanz. It's what the Russians did, if it was the Russians, when they turned off the power by flipping those switches in the Ukraine. And where are we headed in the world? To a world of vastly more targets. Your autonomous car, right? Your web-enabled refrigerator, your Nest web-enabled thermostat at home. Some of these can just be a nuisance. Some of them can be more than a nuisance. If, for example, you can figure out how to turn off most of the gas distribution in the United States through the pipelines in the middle of the winter. So there are all kinds of potential military or just short of war kind of uses that you can imagine for these. Time for just one or two more, yeah. Look, I brought it up in a historical context to say this is not the first time we have seen this. And we've gone ebb and flow in this country in many different ways. We've seen, as I said, journalists who were imprisoned during the Civil War. We saw the Espionage Act passed in 1917, which to this day the government periodically threatens to use against journalists, although they have never actually succeeded in doing it, because if you read the plain language of the Espionage Act, if you make public a classified document, knowingly make public a classified document, you can be subject to the Espionage Act. Well, let's see here. We've written about WikiLeaks, we've written about Snowden, we've written about the Pentagon Papers, and the list is long. But we also came to an interesting place in this country after the Pentagon Papers first came out in the late 60s, and the Nixon administration went to court to try to get what's known as a prior restraint, an advanced restraint against publishing. And the Supreme Court made it pretty clear that's not how this country works. You publish first, and then you sort out the legal procedures thereafter. That the bias is in favor of publication. And then in another big Supreme Court case, Times v. Sullivan, we took the theory a little bit further, which is to say, yeah, there are libel laws and there are zones of privacy that you don't publish about ordinary citizens. But once you have entered the public world, and they didn't quite define how that is, but I would say if you say voluntarily decided to run for president of the United States, which is not something that you're required to do usually, you have pretty much at that point entered into a world where you're in a different legal zone about what can be published about you. And that's because we want the give and take of debate, and we want bad information to be washed out by good. But you don't necessarily want to be in a world in which libel laws are used to restrain political debate. And that's why, if you are a public figure, there's a completely different set of rules. And I didn't hear that being discussed in that conversation the other day. And I think maybe it's worth our going back and reflecting why it is we operate that way. Yeah, the question is, investigative journalism seems to work by embarrassing those in power, if I have this right, with a revelation about something they did and then brings about change. And what if you get a leader who's impervious to that? Well, the fact of the matter is, it doesn't always bring about change. I mentioned the great work that Jim Risen and Eric Lichtblau did on the warrantless wiretapping story. And it was a phenomenal story because it showed that the President of the United States had knowingly routed around legislation Congress had passed about what procedure you go through to get a warrant against an American to be able to listen into their conversations through the secret FISA court, the Federal Intelligence and Surveillance Court. But in the end, Congress reacted to that by changing the law to essentially make what President Bush ordered to be legal. You know, at the time the stories came out, I thought, well, there's no way Congress is going to back up what the president did. But in an era where we're fearful of terrorism, that's exactly what they did. So you can write this and these kinds of stories, and you might bring about awareness and perhaps outrage, but there's no guarantee you're going to bring about change. I've written stories I thought would have significant impact that have had absolutely none, and I've written stories that I couldn't imagine would have any impact, and I discovered to my shock that they did. So our ability to predict that depends a lot on the political conditions at the time. Yeah. The reporters who work on that were working on it for a number of months, and it was a very hard subject matter. There's a chapter in Confront and Conceal, the book I published in 2012, that deals just with the decision to go intervene in Libya, and it was based in part on conversations with a number of different players, including Secretary Clinton, but they were all in office at the time. And so I learned some things from this series of stories that Joe Becker and Scott Shane did, which started running on Sunday. There were two main stories that taught me some things I didn't know. Now, why pick on that particular subject? And I think the answer to that is that Libya is one of those rare cases where you saw Barack Obama's worldview and Hillary Clinton's worldview diverge. So President Obama has made pretty clear that he came in as the president to get us out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was extremely reluctant to have to go back into Afghanistan and now back into Iraq. He's been consistently reluctant to get involved in Syria, where he couldn't see the outcome. But Libya was a different case, where we thought there was going to be a huge humanitarian disaster as Gaddafi's forces approached Benghazi. And the French And eventually the Arab League and others said, we're going to go take action, and we need some backup help from the United States. This is the reverse of the way things usually happen in the world, right? Bob Gates, who we were talking about before, was in his last weeks as defense secretary, and he opposed the American entry into the war. He said, we have no vital national interests in Libya. And Secretary Clinton, who usually sided with Gates, took the opposite view. And her view was that there was an imminent humanitarian disaster. She was motivated by memories of her husband's administration in Rwanda, where the United States sat back. And she took a much more activist view and really wanted to roll the dice. And when you read that story, you discover that in the first few weeks after this, they thought that they had a pretty big victory, because not only had they saved Benghazi, but ultimately Gaddafi was on the run, and ultimately he was captured and killed. But when you look at it 3 years later, what you discover is a country that is in total chaos. And so the bet that Secretary Clinton took, which in my own view was an entirely reasonable bet at the time, simply didn't work out because the institutions were not there, and we weren't prepared, for good reason, to be on the ground to go try to create those institutions. We tried that in Iraq and Afghanistan, thank you, and it didn't work. But I think it gave you an interesting picture of how her mind operated. As for the timing, I wasn't involved in the discussions of that. I know the people who were working on it for a long time, and I think they ran the story when it was ready. I mean, to sit on it long past the nomination process doesn't seem to make much sense. People are trying to come up with an evaluation of what kind of president Hillary Clinton would make. I think you'll find we're pretty even-handed about this. I suspect you'll probably read some about some of the Republican candidates too. Just they weren't involved in recent years in that level of decision-making in national security. Very good. I think that we are just about out of time, but I thank you much. I'll be around a little bit after, so I appreciate you coming out.